Hi, welcome to day 5 of the Pearson Center's Conference on Change. My name is Terrence Hunsley. I'm the Senior Fellow at the Pearson Center. And as you may know, the Center is a progressive think tank, and I'm pleased to point out that this is the only think tank conference that engages with representatives from all 5 federal political parties, as well as top business and labor leaders and experts in the various fields that are being reviewed in the conference. Over 3 weeks, this conference consists of 12 webinars. The focus is simple. With everything changing around us, how do we plan for a long term while responding to the current situation and crisis that we have? So I want to take just a moment to acknowledge that the Pearson Center is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. I also want to thank our sponsors. The platinum sponsor is Bruce Power. Gold sponsors are CN and the Hill Times. And a special thank you to long-standing sponsors, Canada's Building Trades Unions, the International Association of Firefighters, and Amatsio. This afternoon, there are 2 sessions. The first will be on the future of work, and it will go for an hour. For this discussion, we have a great roster of guests. Rose LeMay, who is CEO of the Indigenous Reconciliation Group. Leah Nord, who is Senior Director of Workforce Strategies and Inclusive Growth at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Dean Allison, who has not joined us yet, but I hope will, the Conservative MP for Niagara West Glanbrook and past chair of the Human Resources and Skills Development Committee of the House of Commons, and Eleni Bakopanos, chair of the National Board of Directors of Equal Voice and a former MP from Montreal. Our moderator is Sean Strickland, Executive Director of Canada's Building Trades Union, which is a leader in skills development across Canada and in growth of the green economy. The second session, at 1 o'clock, we will have a seamless transition. I say that with all of the confidence of someone who doesn't know how it actually takes place. But we will have a transition to the second session, which will be a discussion with Stephen Poloz, currently an advisor at Hostlers and former governor of the Bank of Canada. He will be in conversation with Sandra Pupatello, chair of the Pearson Center and a former economic and trade minister for Ontario. Just before I hand it over to the moderator, I want to make a couple of quick points on the future of work, which is one of the top priorities of the Pearson Center. We released our report entitled Future Work Policies for the 2020s at the annual conference last year. Some of the thoughts that were in there, one is that fragmentation of work, which has been going on for some time, is leading to a situation where more and more workers are going to be self-employed, either throughout their working career or at some point within it, and that education systems are going to have to adapt and find ways to prepare people for that kind of a situation. Another recommendation was for a major expansion in adult training, retraining, and lifelong learning. And a third, it was for the federal government to revisit the program of sector councils, which they had run for some time several years ago. And on that, I was really quite pleased to see that there was a provision in the budget yesterday for what they have termed a sectoral solutions program. And we're kind of hoping that those sectoral approaches will also consider working conditions, pay standards for workers in the sectors that are being addressed. There were several other recommendations at the time, and I'm sure we'll hear discussion of many of those subjects today. So with that, I will thank our moderator, Sean Strickland, and turn it over to you, Sean.
Well, thanks very much, Terrence, and thanks very much for that nice introduction and segue and a little bit of an encapsulation of some of the key elements with respect to workforce development contained in yesterday's quite lengthy and comprehensive budget. So I'd like to welcome everyone who's tuned in to this session on economic rebuilding and the future of work. I'd also like to welcome our panelists, Leah, Rose, and Eleni. Looking forward to a good discussion this afternoon. And let's kick things off. It's the day after the budget. So as I was joking previously with the panelists, we could spend a lot of time talking about the budget. We only have 45 minutes. But in terms of the future of work and the disruptive change that our workplaces have experienced pre-COVID, and now we're moving into, hopefully sooner rather than later, post-COVID. And so we've had enough change in our workplace without the overlay of a pandemic. And now we have the pandemic, and what's work going to look like post-COVID and into economic recovery. So Leah, what do you think about the budget yesterday? Did it do enough to position Canada for economic growth in the future?
Thanks, Sean. It's such a pleasure to be here with you moderating and my fellow panelists here this afternoon. And as you say, there'll be no shortage of conversation to be had. Quickly on the budget from the business community, very happy for the record to see the continued supports for our businesses as we proceed through this crisis. You know, the wage subsidy that will help keep our employees connected to the workforce, as well as with the hiring credit, the rent credit as well. What I thought was really interesting in the skills space was an increasing recognition of what's needed in the future of work. Terrence in his introduction had made focus on the sectoral approach, but from the Canadian Chamber, we were really encouraged around the programming coming forward. We can get into more details, both that it looks not only sectorally, but at a community level. At a local level, local solutions for local problems. And we think that's one of the keys that has been missing in the Canadian workforce skills and planning space. As well, a number of the programs are specifically focused on our small and medium-sized businesses, Sean, and we can't underscore the key to that, right? 98% of our businesses in Canada, which are the economic drivers of this country and economy, are small and medium-sized businesses. The last thing I will say is what's going to be important. I mean, there was something for everyone in this budget, and a lot of dollars associated with that will be implementation on some very important measures, and I'm sure we'll talk about childcare. Canadian Chamber has some thoughts on that as well, but also ensuring that these measures lead to economic growth. In the absence of that, we're going to be in really, to state the obvious, a lot of trouble with deficits and debts. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. And so obviously you keyed in on these sectoral initiatives, and Terrence talked about that from his opening comments as well. Rose, what about your perspective? Does the budget go far enough? Has it done a good job in recognizing the changing nature of work going forward and helping position us for growth, and particularly with some of the folks in the organization you represent?
Thanks, Sean, and thanks to my panelists as well, Lena and Leah. This is going to be a great discussion. When I tried to wade through the 730-some page budget, it occurred to me that we're moving out of the time of small government. This is the most clearest sign that we could get that the federal government sees a place for itself that it hasn't really ventured into for quite a while, from direct supports to entrepreneurial, to increase that number. There's always been supports for those who've already started, but also huge amounts of money going to infrastructure. Now that is a big deal. There's an incredible amount of rust out infrastructure from cities to communities to highways. So that's a fairly different shift. I also noted that there was a good sum of money to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Now the number might seem a bit large, 18 billion, it's hard to tell within that amount how much is actually new money. Some of it is renewal of existing programs. Some of it really is to address the major problem of rust out within funding programs that go to these communities. And there is new money in there for things that have not received new money in a long time. Also infrastructure, also supports for small business. I think from my perspective, when I read over some of the pieces of it, this is quite a shift for this country. I think it's well timed. I don't know how else we could move forward post-COVID. I think my worry is around the level of detail, right? While it is a substantial document, it also is premised on the need for partnership with provinces and territories, the need for partnership between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Most of that, a lot of the new programs that exist in that 18 billion for Indigenous peoples is predicated on partnership, that the federal government can't go ahead and simply design a program on a napkin. It needs to do the work to co-design. And so I think now the need for accountability will be on how will that occur? How will those pieces of co-development work? Are communities, are provinces and territories ready to dig into virtually every sector? There is some pots of money across many sectors, and are we ready? Is the infrastructure, is even the internet, do we have enough internet to ensure that the consultation occurs in a good way and effectively as quickly as we can?
Well, interesting. Any budget, of course, as you rightly point out, Rose, is really about the details and implementation, and Canadians and the Canadian Federation cooperation with the provinces. And it was interesting, just from my perspective, when you talk about infrastructure, because Canada's building trades unions, we're advocating strongly for increased infrastructure investment. And I think the way the government approached it was a much more targeted approach to infrastructure. And they also broadened the definition of infrastructure to not just, bridges and construction, but social infrastructure as well. And so I think the government took a much more targeted approach to that infrastructure in terms of those increased investments over and above the commitment they made in previous budgets. I think the key is going to be, as you point out, is that cooperation with provincial provinces and feds on all kinds of different fronts. But from an infrastructure perspective, how quickly can these projects get rolled out? Often they get entangled in bureaucratic delay, provincial federal relations. It gets politicized. So it's key for them to roll out, because infrastructure is a tried and true way of helping move the economy through slowdowns and recessions. So hoping to see quick rollouts of infrastructure right across all the different areas they've announced.
Absolutely, and others have said, and rightly so, that reconciliation has no meaning until we address some of these fundamental issues in communities. The 4 billion backlog in housing. You and I, if we were to see some of the housing that exists in First Nations communities, some Inuit communities, we could not say the word respect of Indigenous peoples or priority of this relationship and maintain this housing stock. And so I'm really looking forward to some of that infrastructure and some partners in your sector, Sean, to help with housing, because it's an emergency.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Yes, it's the housing conditions. Some of our First Nations Indigenous communities is absolutely deplorable, and we need the full attention to resolve that for sure. Eleni, what do you think? Does the budget go far enough to recognize the future, the changing future of work, and position Canada for economic growth? Eleni, you're on mute.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. I had to say it one time today.
Please do. I keep forgetting. But I think that the budget tried, as Rose and Leah both said, to do something for everyone. The pandemic showed that it brought to light the gender inequalities that exist. It also brought to light who are the essential workers. in this society. The essential workers are mostly women. I mean, 16,000 women dropped out of the workforce during this pandemic, yet I think the number was 19,000 men entered, or 91,000, maybe I'm getting the figures wrong. The point is that this pandemic hit women, and I think the budget did try to address the inequalities by giving money to certain programs that will help essential workers. But I don't think it goes back far enough. I also think, using the words that the finance minister used, she wants a more resilient Canada, one that's fairer, one that's better. We've got to look at the well-being of our population. It isn't only about the physical structures, it's also how do we provide mental health, for example, services to people who are going through this pandemic. I don't think they addressed that enough. I don't think there was enough addressed in the budget in terms of the well-being. There was language in the budget for it. Was there enough for the women? I mean, the main program, of course, is the early learning and childcare program that they want to roll out. Now, will the provinces, the question is, will the provinces play politics with this? Are they going to tell the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance that we just want the money, and then we'll do what we think is right? We'll go down either the private childcare route, or we're going to go to a comprehensive, easily accessible type of system that Quebec has, which is what their ultimate aim is, to have a $10 a day daycare. Will that happen? I was there. I was a parliamentary secretary when Ken Dryden was the minister. So I know the challenges that we faced when we had those discussions with the provinces. And the one province we delivered immediately to was Quebec. So it's going to depend a lot on how willing the provincial premiers will put their politics aside and will actually sit down at the table and discuss with the government how are they going to roll one of the most important programs for women, in my opinion, across this country. For women to go back to work, they have to have a universal, easily accessible daycare program with early learning. And I want to insist on that. It's not about babysitting. It's about early learning also. And I have to stress that, because people think, well, give a check, as has been the case in the past of other governments. That's enough. It doesn't even buy the diapers that you need if you've got 3 kids or 4 kids, the check you're getting. So you need to have a universal, easily accessible type of program that Quebec has very successfully put into place. So I'm looking to see what's going to happen in the future. Are the provinces going to sit down? And that could apply to some of the other programs also. You know, we're giving out money, but is that money then going to be used by the provinces in order to take care, as I said, of the essential workers who are at the front lines of this pandemic, who have lost their job, and who hopefully see in this budget a ray of hope that the government really does want to do something for them. And I'm talking about all women, Indigenous women, rationalized women. I mean, these are the type of inequalities that the pandemic really brought to light. And I think the government is really trying to address it, but they can't do it alone. We live in a system where you need the provincial governments to step up to the plate, to collaborate, to cooperate, and to work together to be able to make sure that the type of economy that we want, that takes care of its people, will in fact become a reality and not just a bunch of words that were in the budget.
Well, thanks, Eleni. And let's just maybe talk about like the major announcement in the budget, landmark, milestone is the early learning and childcare. And we were signaled prior to the budget that was going to happen. And this is a very significant program for the Canadian government and for Canadians. And you quote the program in Quebec that's been in place for quite some time. And I was interested in reading recently about labor force participation for women in Quebec is significantly higher than it is in other provinces. And they attribute that directly to the daycare or childcare, I think is a better way to describe it, programs. Leah, from a business perspective in the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, is a national childcare program, in your view, is it going to deliver on greater labor force participation for women, improve productivity? What's your view on that from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce?
Sean, thanks for the question. And I think it is important to acknowledge that yesterday's budget A was delivered by our first female Minister of Finance, and that B, this is historical and unprecedented funding. For the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we do have a Council for Women's Advocacy, and we do applaud the government for recognizing this as an issue that isn't a women's issue, it is an economic issue, and the Quebec model has demonstrated the increase in labor participation rates. We called for national leadership on this, recognizing the disproportionate effect that the pandemic has had on women, and welcome the investments. I mean, we do have some concerns. I think they've been addressed here, the idea of provincial territorial involvement. And this is a huge step forward, but we've been talking about this for a number of years, and the Canadian Chamber's concern is what happens between now and the implementation of a national daycare program. Eleni, you've been talking about the women who have been falling out of the workforce since November. Here in Ontario and in many other jurisdictions, we're in a third wave, and I apologize for the noise behind us, but this is online learning from home and lunchtime, folks. This is a continued reality that's through the third wave and even into the summer. We're concerned that more women will fall out of the workforce between now and then. And our other issue is this daycare and early learning is community, and it's about parents and families and a continuum of care. Right? We do appreciate the increase in the labor forces, but the reality is when you don't work 9 to 5 or you rely on family for childcare or filling in the gaps, we want to see an inclusivity and the parents and business voice involved in that as well, Sean, is what I would say. Thanks.
Can I add something, Sean? Can I ask?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Eleni.
A lot of the women in Quebec who actually work in the daycare centers are actually not remunerated appropriately. It's one thing also that there are a large number of women working, and I didn't hear anything in terms of how that will also be addressed. Obviously, they have minimum wage in terms of going up to $15, which will help. Of course, we'll see how fast the legislation gets to the House. I mean, how fast then they'll sit down with the provinces, but it's mostly women who are working at the daycare centers, and it's mostly women working with minimum wage, basically, in some daycare centers. So I didn't see, even though we did talk about putting this program across Canada, universal program, but and accessible, and I want to insist on it being accessible. Okay, because there were a lot of cases, I think, in the past where women who weren't working were in fact using the $10 a day service, okay, and just to do their errands or do their other shopping or whatever. This was really a type of a program put in Quebec for women who are in the workforce. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't be open to other women, but there could be different types of daycare centers. Okay, but that will, like I said, the devil's in the details. We haven't seen the legislation. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but I thought it was important to underline.
We want to have a discussion here, and I would just say, in terms of your latter point, like any program that's got universality attached to it, you're going to have those, just human nature, who are going to to whatever extent abuse the program, and we got to put in place the right kind of guideposts to minimize that happening. Well, I know from my own experience that when it comes to wage subsidies for early childcare workers and childcare providers, that's where you get into the provincial regulation. And I know in Ontario, for example, there are top-up programs from the provincial government over the number of years to help with wage subsidy for childcare workers. So we'll have to see what happens there.
Let's hope they go across Canada. Let's hope every province does that.
For sure. Yeah. And I'm sure that'll be subject to part of the negotiation. And Leah, your point is also well taken in terms of, and Eleni emphasized it as well, that this isn't like just for women. I mean, that's critically important, of course, but this is for families. And you know, our industry, the industry that I am, is predominantly male dominated, and we're doing whatever we can to encourage more women to get into the skilled trades workforce. And this kind of program is going to help. This kind of program is also going to help with attracting more young people into the trades. Like the average age of the apprentice in Canada right now is 27 years of age. You know, 30 years ago was 18 or 19 years of age. And so I think this is a good program for all Canadians and all sectors. Rose, what do you think in terms of the National Childcare Program and the announcement and its impact on the future of work for Canada?
Well, I have to tell you, I've been waiting since World Fit for Children and Canada Fit for Children. Now, you have to be as old as me to remember when we used to talk.
I remember.
Inclusion of children. And we used to talk about early learning about being more than just for the kids. It's actually about building community. Kids are interacting well with others. They're building the social skills to be ready for school to succeed. When parents are involved in that hub, which becomes early learning, parents are connected and building community. The prime example is Aboriginal Head Start Off Reserve. It was a program that was started in the mid-90s. It was started at a very high funding level. It was meant to serve Indigenous kids off reserve. It was meant to be community building, and it was funded really highly. And it found that for every dollar we put into early learning, we save at least $7 and maybe all the way up to $11 in future reduced educational issues, reduced justice, reduced, name all these issues that we end up paying for downstream when kids aren't ready for school. So this is going to save the economy in the end. This is going to save us money if we do early learning well. And it doesn't mean just a Band-Aid solution. It does mean that it's highly funded. It means that the staff have their bachelors of early learning. They're well trained, well supported. Facilities are built for the safety and learning for our kids. That's what it was intended to be. We have done it in the past in Canada, and as Leah and Eleni, you've noted, it's really now up to the provinces to come to the table. The evidence is so strong, and I have to tell you, if politics get in the way with this, I will be so disgusted. I will just be so disgusted that my grandkid cannot go to a well-funded, well-run early learning program. Many other countries do this. This isn't rocket science. This is actually the easiest thing we can do. So I'm looking forward to it.
I think you have concurrence from all of the panelists around, you know, if it gets politicized, no one wants to see that. You know, we need to focus on delivering that program and coming together as Canadians from coast to coast. I'm just wondering, maybe if we could just talk a little bit about the changing nature of work in general and technological change, of course, overlaid with this COVID. And I'll just, you know, maybe share a little bit of an interesting example from my industry, and that construction is, I would say, not the most technologically advanced industry. Like, we pour concrete now the same way we did 100 years ago, pretty well. There's been some advances, but we're starting to see more and more changes in technological advancement. You know, one example would be the use of drones. You know, you have drones now that can circle around a construction project and engage the consumption of materials, can place an order with material supplier for 4 days hence based on how much materials can be left on the job, and make these kinds of you know, high speed in real time decisions to help construction projects work more quickly. That's just one example. There's technologies been around for a while now where you have a robot that can brick a small house. And so we're seeing more and more change happening in our industry. And I gotta say that it's really tough for our industry to adapt to some of these technological changes that are coming, and how do we find the right spots for workers to continue working. Prefabrication of housing units, long-term care based out of COVID. We've seen ramp ups in prefabrication of long-term care and retirement homes, which are all basically manufactured in a manufacturing plant. So that's going to be a big change for our industry that we're going to have to work on. We're continuing to look at ways to help our workers transition to that. What do you see, Leah, in terms of from the chamber and the changing nature of work and the kind of, I don't want to say deindustrialization, but the movement away from more traditional kinds of work where you manufacture or produce a good and that good gets sold, and the advent of technology. What's the chamber seeing in that area going forward?
Another great and important question, Sean, and what we talk about actually as the change in the nature of work, and we can delve into that a bit deeper, but overall, aside from the work from home trend in many sectors, but I will emphasize not all and not the majority of sectors in this country. The other concern we had, or what we, it's accelerated trends, first of all, COVID has, and we were watching the automation file very closely because, with restrictions and the inability to be in person, we were concerned about the automation role. First of all, I have to be honest and say that we partner the Canadian Chamber with the Canadian StatsCan on the Canadian Survey of Business Conditions. And where we are seeing changes right now is around cybersecurity and how businesses are taking up there. The automation trend isn't taking off, I would say, yet. And I would also say understandably, as it's more or less a day-to-day survival. But I think, Sean, this is really the way of the future. And I know, pre-pandemic, there was that infamous study that by, I think it was December 2019, 50% of jobs would be taken over by robots in Canada, right? And there's all this fear, but I think what we really have to do is harness this for good, right? I think the technology is amazing in areas of manufacturing, of natural resourcing, mining, construction, and what we have to be able to do is not be afraid of it, is to harness this and take it forward. And, a lot of work that's being done around, these aren't the industries of our grandmothers and grandfathers, right? That there's a lot you can do with this, and there's a lot you need to do with it, and you have to embrace it rather than be afraid of it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that I would agree that we have to embrace it, but also at the same time from CBTU's perspective, we're embracing the new technologies and training our workers and do what we can for like small modular reactors, for example, and carbon sequestering and carbon capturing, where, we're doing all that. But at the same time, we have to protect and maintain as many jobs as we possibly can, because Canada went through, basically, I used the word earlier, a deindustrialization in the 80s and 90s, and there was many folks who were never able to re-enter the workplace at the same place and the same position as they left it. So I think this budget tries to address that.
I think it also addresses lifelong learning. And yes. I think it's something that the Pearson Center has also in their report talked about. So we've got two generations, right? We have a generation that feels very comfortable with the technology, is able to use it, will have no problem adjusting in terms of what is happening out there in the digital world. But then we've got another generation who are not yet ready to retire, let's put it that way, or are not close to retirement, but yet they see technology as a huge challenge. And I think that the government is conscious of this, and so are the provinces, and we've got to be able to use some of the money, and I think Chrystia Freeland did address somewhat in 2 or 3 programs in terms of people having access to lifelong learning. For example, in the past, we also had a registered educational plan that you could use in order to return back to school. School is not what it used to be also. So online learning is another challenge. And here we go in terms of if you've got 3 people in a household, okay, all using the internet, does everyone have access to the internet? Are people in rural Canada able to have that access so that they won't be left behind as they have been when we became an industrial nation and we moved away from the agricultural sector to the sectors that we have today? So I think a big challenge is right now is how do you train the workforce which has or does not have the skills to go into the digital workforce, because that's what it's going to be. We're going to have remote working. We may have 2 or 3 days that people go into the office, or maybe we'll have 2 or 3 days that they're going to be, able to meet with a team. If I can use the example, and maybe I'll regress a little bit about MPs. When I was an MP, of course, we had to be in Ottawa to vote. We had to be in Ottawa physically sitting there. Now, MPs certainly can work from home. They can work from anywhere. In fact, they can also vote. There's been some challenges, of course, but I think we've proven that, in fact, you can adjust to a health crisis, epidemic, and still be able to continue your responsibilities if you have access to the type of technology and the type of security also, and we won't even touch that because that's another issue in itself, the type of security to be able to do your job. But at the same time, women are also taking care of teaching their kids or helping them with online learning. They have the care of elders. I, for example, have two 91-year-old parents that live on their own, thank God, not in one of the homes, but at the same time, I'm their link to the outside world. They are totally technologically challenged, okay? But we do have other issues that the budget itself did not address, but there was words in the budget to say that they're looking at it. It's not about only the economy, it's about the well-being of Canadians and how do we make them feel that they can contribute to the recovery of this economy. And it's not only about money, it's not only about the GDP, that's important, but it's also about the well-being, the social infrastructure. See. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleni. I appreciate those comments for sure. And Rose, you know, one of Eleni's comments was about the increased digitization of work, and you know, we've experienced that through COVID. Do you see this being amplified in the future? It's going to accelerate at a quicker pace?
I don't think we have any option but to accelerate, or we as a country will be left behind. My worry is that what COVID has done, and so often in this sector as well, is we're widening the gap between the have and the have-nots. High-speed internet is a given in cities, although apparently not in Toronto. Thanks, Rogers. Hope you fixed it yesterday. But you know what? High-speed internet is still a dream for many, many communities, especially north of 55 and latitude, the provinces. There's communities in the territories that still struggle with the equivalent of dial-up. So if we want to talk about the inclusion of Indigenous peoples, the inclusion of all Canadians, we really need to fix the backbone of internet, which is beyond me. I'm not entirely sure how this will happen. We're going to have to string fiber optic everywhere. But it also gets at, this is the thing that limits lifelong learning. I have courses in my company that are offered online. They would be impossible to access in parts of the country because there's video. This webinar may not even be available all across the country. But I actually want to focus back to another issue that sort of goes hand in hand, and I don't think as a country nor this budget we've really figured this out, is mental wellness. A whole bunch of Canadians have figured out how to digitize as much as we can. We're on webinars a lot. We are also isolated. And so I'm not sure what the answers, there's more than one, will be around this. We will need to digitize. We will need to move more of the economy to a more shock-resistant online format than we have right now. But I'm not entirely sure how we're going to maintain our mental wellness and our sense of community. I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't get the same kind of energy and sense of belonging online. So how do we actually also strengthen this sense of community and belonging? Because it doesn't happen online very well.
It's a huge challenge, huge challenge.
And that's interesting. You know, just personally, I've pretty well been in lockdown like most people. I remember last year, March 13th, we were luckily enough, we were going to go to Florida, and we canceled, and been pretty well working from home ever since, except for a few stints here and there in between. And I was doing pretty well until Friday. And then when we got that announcement on Friday about, you know, in Ontario, 6 more weeks of lockdown, May 20th, and there were some items in there, obviously, that the government backed off on. But mental wellness is important. I have 2 adult age children, and you know, we're trying to stay in touch with them and do whatever we can to break down that isolation. You're absolutely right. If we're going to have a digitized economy going forward, we have to figure out a way on how we could still connect to people, because as humans, we are social beings. Leah, do you want to kind of weigh in a little bit of this general discussion on the future of work?
Yeah, I mean, the mental health. I mean, what we say is, first and foremost, this has been a health crisis, followed by an economic crisis, and quick on this heels is a mental health crisis that we're not. I don't think we've seen the full effect of this as well. And everyone, every single person, whatever your reality is, has been affected. That, some more than others. We're not trying to deny that, but everybody has. And I think that's important to acknowledge as well. One piece in the time that we do have left, I'd actually welcome the opportunity to address, I know the Pearson Center is big on entrepreneurship and some lifelong learning pieces, but I really do want to give credit to the Pearson Center and to Andrew specifically for sort of putting this on the agenda. Before the crisis, again, we have plenty of data. It's all you do need technical skills, but it was the employers looking for, D2L calls them durable skills, and I think that's a lot more realistic. It never really caught on because they're known as soft skills or human skills, but I think entrepreneurship is key to this and takes that to the next level. So, we know what we have to do in this lifelong learning and upskilling and reskilling and soft skills fields. We know so much of this, but really kudos to the Pearson Center for putting that on. I think I said it was early on, and who knew that we would still be needing to say it now. But what I've said is sort of resilience as a soft skill gets you through the crisis, but entrepreneurship really moves it forward. So we talk about, communication and adaptability and resilience and self-initiative, but entrepreneurship is key to this going forward. We've seen, from our business community, and even again back to that survey, we track diversity business owners who've had to pivot and really shown, we've suffered a lot, but sort of we've also told the story of dynamism and innovation and women leaving the workforce for any number of reasons, but then becoming entrepreneurs on their own, and any number of examples within the Indigenous community as well, within minority-owned businesses. So really, with the future of work, something to put on the table. As well. And the only other thing, just so I have an option as well, I know there was a question about, maybe requiring everyone to take a course in lifelong learning. How do we really move this needle? And there's a lot of things that can be said, but I think we really do have to look at motivation of individuals as well. I think we'd be naive not to, and looking at, what motivates them, but also helping them make, navigate the world and making informed decisions on if they do want to take that leap into studying, what will help them, not only what they want to do, but how they can be helped in this digitized world. Thanks.
And to arrive there, I think we need a different type of leader. I think we have to look, where has the pandemic been dealt with well? And I think it's been dealt well where you've had women leaders, where you've had leaders also who have shown compassion, who have shown collaborative efforts in terms of understanding what their citizens are going through. I think we have to change the norm of what are our expectations also in terms of the type of leadership, be it in the business community, be it in the Indigenous community, be it in women's leadership, in terms of the type of leaders that are going to get us through and who will actually understand some of the challenges, including the mental health challenge that their citizens are going through. So I think we also have to look at who's going to get us through this, because we're not through it, and we're not even halfway, in my opinion. And I do want to do a shout out to all the small business entrepreneurs who have been put in such a position where, they're told to open, they're told to close, they take all the precautions. My heart goes out to them. My father was a small businessman. I understand what the challenges are and how hard it is to be able to run a business. So a shout out to them and to the Pearson Center for actually acknowledging that, because honestly, I think they're the ones who have suffered most under this this pandemic in terms of their well-being also.
If I could just step in there, as we look to trying to take the next step to get out of this COVID, I think what we really should be talking about is a health and wellness policy is actually economic policy. The more we can stabilize individuals, families, and communities, the more able we will be able to work. As an entrepreneur, Sean, I on Friday also was thinking, I don't know if I can do this. It's so difficult to manage all the pressures that we have as adults and for older aging parents and kids and grandkids and the families all around us and neighbors. How we start to manage the relationships and supporting each other, it sounds like the soft stuff, but this is what we're missing right now, is how we reach out to each other over a coffee or at the pub and show that support. This is what I'm really missing, and I would hasten, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is what we all probably are missing too. And also, you know what, we can do better in leadership. My God, I'm from Ontario, and I'm going to try not to use the F word today. Why, Ford? Why? But I also just want to give a final shout out to the Pearson Center, because this is Landon Pearson's budget, isn't it?
Hello, yes.
Coming to Landon Pearson's
Agreed.
budget. Thank
Agreed.
you, Landon Pearson, for all of your advocacy. I think we finally got it on paper. Let's hope to God this money moves.
Well, Rose, thanks very much for those comments. And Leah, you know, your comments about entrepreneurship, I think for a long time, Canada's needed more entrepreneurs. And you know, that's something that I hope the Chamber continues to encourage. And Eleni, you know, in terms of style of leadership, your work and the job that you do with the equal voice, we need more women in politics. So I think that that's critically important to help frame the debate and provide a different style of leadership that we've traditionally received. And I think, you know, Minister Freeland's historic budget yesterday is a good sign for that.
Well, it took a woman. It took a woman to bring in universal, accessible, early learning and childcare to actually make it a reality. So a big shout out.
I'll give you that. I'll give you that. I'll give you that. I'm not going to go tit for tat on that.
Don't.
I'll give you that. I'll give you that. I'll give you that.
Listen, when you talked about members of parliament, I mean, when I was in parliament, we were at 20%. We're at 29%. Can you imagine, you know, 100 years, we're celebrating 100 years of women in parliament, and we've only moved the needle to 29%, okay? When it's 51% of the population. I'm not only talking about all women. They're even less, the numbers even go down less when you look at Black women in parliament, when you look at racialized women, when you look at the LGBTQ+2 community, when you look at all the diversity, it doesn't exist. And I think you make good policy when you've got that inclusion, when you've got that diversity. So I'm very proud of the work that Equal Voice is doing to try to move the needle, but we need everybody. We need everybody working towards that, to make sure that that we vote first, and secondly, that we actually do have a new type of leadership coming into parliament. And there are men who can, you know, who are compassionate in that. I don't want to, you know, say that it's only the women that have those qualities. But I think working together in a more collaborative, more compassionate way, we'll be able to better address the challenges that this pandemic threw at us. But at the same time, do we know if there isn't another health crisis coming up? Are we prepared for another health crisis? Maybe the mental health crisis that Rose spoke about. So are we prepared? I'm not so sure personally, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Yes, well, we really do hope that we've learned from this pandemic, federal and provincial leaders alike, and hopefully we don't have to put those learnings into place again anytime soon. Well, I did promise the audience we're coming to the end of our hour. It's gone by really quickly. It's been a great discussion, but I did promise the audience an opportunity for some questions, and we do have a couple, mostly centered on childcare. And maybe Rose, I can ask you to, in no particular order, Hang on for a second. I got another question coming in, and I just have to apologize to the audience. I just want to make sure that we get as relevant a questions as possible. All the questions are welcome. So, Rose, what should government and private sector do to advance Indigenous employment?
So I guess the question would be, what are the barriers for employment for Indigenous peoples? Education is at times a barrier. The lack of good schools in K-12 on reserve. There is some money in the budget to address some of that. Not entirely sure it will close the gap. Sometimes racism and systemic discrimination are barriers. There was a little bit of money. It went to a non-Indigenous organization in the budget. It's a bit concerning. That is a failure that every single sector, every single leader needs to take on and move that needle somehow. That is sometimes a barrier to Indigenous employment. The highest proportion of women in entrepreneurial positions is actually Indigenous women. So we have a lot of things to share, and we're doing well in some areas. I think the more we can support the mentorship, the education, the post-secondary education of Indigenous peoples, we will continue to see the increases that we are seeing in Indigenous employment.
Well, thanks for that. Now, obviously, yeah, barriers right on. And just a little shout out to my organization. Right now we're actually in a training session. It's titled Indigenous Awareness Training, and so we're training dozens and dozens of unions right across the country on Indigenous awareness, and just the history of the Indigenous peoples, and providing, as it may sound basic, but just the right kind of tools for communication with Indigenous tradespeople, and improving the level of comfortability. And so there's a lot of work we need to do there for sure, Rose.
Thanks, Sean,
another quick question. Let's go.
How come you didn't do my course? But okay, good for you.
Well, we developed our own course, Rose, and then we also with a trainer, because we've been working with building trades across Canada on Indigenous employment for quite some time, and we also have the Office for the Advancement of Women Apprentices. But certainly, Rose, future course development will keep you and your organization in mind. I appreciate that. Just a kind of rapid fire here, the last few minutes. Green jobs, Leah, what about green jobs in the future? Is the government doing enough to promote that? Is private sector there yet?
Yeah, and the solution to this is not terribly enticing, but one that I speak a lot to. So let's talk about, some people talk about a K-shaped recovery. We're still in K-shaped crisis, right? So let's take a look at that downward angle. It's sectors. And it's also those in those sectors, right? Youth, minorities, women. To be a young woman right now, or, there's a lot on that downward. So we're going to have to move to that upward. And green is one of those. But folks, we talk about this in a lot of general terms. And we talk about moving, right? More diversity in sectors, be it the trades, be it tech, right? But we also need to in doing this, make sure that it's high demand sectors. It's just not moving groups and cohorts across into that bottom level. And we can think of any number of examples right now in the essential work. But what's key to all of this is labor force planning, right? We need to know where these jobs are. We need to have businesses at the table looking at those jobs that aren't, temporarily furloughed, that are moving away and moving up, right? So looking at those green jobs, but more importantly, what are they? What are the skills and competencies needed? We're not going back for full degrees. Let's move the dial. Let's change the discourse, right? In learning and like we've been talking about a lot of this, Sean, but that's sort of the missing piece I find in the foundational piece. Again, not very exciting to be out there, chirping about, but this labor market analysis is key, and individuals as well, and their skills and assessment, right, moving this way. So again, it's being touted as a green budget and moving again in the right directions, but we just need a little more foundational or proverbial meat to the bone to make it effective. Thanks.
labor force analysis has always been somewhat of a weakness in Canada in terms of having a robust analysis, and we do need to shore that up a little bit. And hopefully the announcement yesterday on those sectoral initiatives will certainly help with that. And I'll just give you a quick example. Like for our organization in Alberta, we have half of our members, probably 20,000 unemployed right now, but in BC is booming. Right. So, what labor force analysis we put into place to recognize that and then provide incentives for those workers even to go temporarily to British Columbia to help get work there and maybe decrease the reliance of temporary foreign workers. So for our industry and construction, that labor force analysis does need to be way more robust for sure. So I appreciate those comments, Leah. Eleni, a question on daycare, childcare. What do you think is the mechanism to ensure that the daycare system is designed to best meet the needs of parents, including, home parents who don't necessarily participate fully in the workforce?
Part-time workers are mostly women also. So I do understand the question, and I thank the question because it's an important one. Are we going to design one type of daycare system across the country? No. What we want across the country is accessibility to daycare for a whole group of women. We can still, work with the private sector on this. We can still work on part-time workers who have to work for, let's say, a 3-hour shift or a night shift or whatever. This is another thing that we have to look at in terms of daycare. Not everybody works 9 to 5. There are many women who work night shifts, nurses, for example, healthcare workers, waitresses. I mean, I can go on and on. So there is not one type of daycare we have to look at. We have to look at the workforce, which Leah also brought up. Have we done analysis in terms of the type of workforce and what are their needs? I can give you an example from my own experience also in terms of parliamentarians. Neither did they have parental leave or childcare. On Parliament Hill, there was one daycare center, okay, to accommodate the public service and also MPs. I was lucky because my husband did have a daycare center at his own work, so he was able to place our 2 daughters in that daycare center. I don't think there is one type of daycare. The whole idea is to make it as accessible as possible for those women and men. This is a family. This is a family. If we go back to also Rose's about the community, it has to be part of the community, the daycare center. It's where the parents can meet, they can discuss, they can also talk about some of the challenges of raising their children, or maybe also be helpful in terms of providing some information to other parents on child rearing strategies that they may have. So I don't think there is one type that we should be looking at, but what we should be looking at is putting across this country structures to be able to accommodate the families that do need this service to be able to continue to work. And even if you work from home, by the way, you do need daycare. You do need a break. You do need, even if you have children who are 5 years old, and we've seen plenty of that in terms of some of the Zoom meetings I've been on where the children are crying on one end, a dog is barking on the other, and you're trying to be able to do a meeting. So I don't think it's one type. I think we have to look at what are the needs and how do the provincial and federal governments respond to that needs. The money's on the table. Now it's how do we design the system to accommodate the workforce.
Thanks, Eleni. And that brings us right up to the end of our time. And just to add to that question, the question was specific to Alberta as well. And I think just picking up on your point, that it's important that childcare advocates and families who are interested in this issue keep the pressure on the provincial governments, because it's really going to be up to them to design what this program is going to look like. So thanks very much to everyone on the panel. Leah, Eleni, Rose, thanks to the Pearson Center.
Thank you.
And to the audience who joined in. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, Leah, Rose. It was a pleasure. And thank you to the Pearson Center. Have a great day.
Well, I think this is how we're rolling right into our next segment. Stephen Poloz, it's great to see you. Oh, I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Sorry.
There you are.
There you go. Sorry.
Okay, so the Roland Bank of Canada looks very good on you. You look the same as you did about 20 years ago. So there's some secrets. They send you into that vault in Ottawa and you don't come out for years.
Yes.
Anyway,
But now I work for a law firm, so I'm guaranteed to look younger.
that's right. Anyway, everybody, welcome to the next segment for the Pearson Center. Let me just give a brief description here. My name is Sandra Pupatello, and I'm happy to be chair of the Pearson Center with lots of volunteers that make events like this happen. And you're meeting several of them over the course of our multi-day conference, which is an annual event for us that this year, being so virtual, we decided to put different segments on different days and different parts of the day as well. So today we have a great opportunity to speak with Stephen Poloz, a gentleman that I had the good fortune to meet while I was minister in Ontario, and he was the head of EDC, Export Development Canada. And it's one thing to have a great job. It's quite another to be there at a critical moment in history. And for Ontario and of course for Canada, that was the Great Recession of 2008, where you had to steer the ship over some very turbulent waters. And I will tell you in the world, if they'll listen, that EDC had a great deal to do with why we still have many companies in Canada, because EDC planted their flag and said, we're going to help. And you probably, Stephen, you're hearkening back to lots of behind the scenes activities, but what we saw at the out of it was new programming where EDC could step in and help. So you have had your hand on the lever of pushing the economy forward in your history. That's before you even got to the Bank of Canada. So then from that perspective, a little more quietly, not so much in the public eye, a little bit kind of like the guy behind the curtain there, where you come out with policies that have done very well for the country over many years. So we welcome you to the Pearson Center. Let me just give you a moment to say a hello, and we're going to jump in with questions that are about your views of rebuilding our economy. Where are we going from here? These are momentous occasions that we get to talk about right now. So welcome, Stephen.
Well, thank you, Sandra. I'm delighted to be here. It's a real pleasure, and enjoying the afterlife, especially, as I said, being part of OSLR, where I'm a special advisor, which has given me all kinds of new dimensions to my work. It's a lot of fun.
Excellent. Oh, that's true. And you know, it's funny, there are going to be a few people on the planet that have managed to be in a post with such a view. And you get to just internalize so many things from so many different perspectives that you're one of the few really that will be able to give really good sage advice. So here we go. We won't. By the way, there's many people listening in right now, and they come from all walks. I just got a note from Mahmoud Nanji. He and I used to work together in my old ministry, and we used to work with you in your office. So we're literally coming from all places to listen today. The budget was just tabled yesterday. The headlines today are obviously all about childcare, rebuilding after the economy, and they're talking about the level of deficit and long-term debt for the government. Give me your overall take on how you interpreted that the budget deposited yesterday. How do you see that?
Well, obviously, it's a very ambitious piece of work. It's well over 700 pages. That was a pretty big job working my way through that yesterday. And there's a lot of good things to say about it. Certainly I usually look at it from a macro perspective without judging the individual elements. But I mean, I think from a macro side, it's not in that sense huge departure from the past, which is, really the way it's being played up. I find very comparable in the baseline spending and taxation lines as we had in 2019 budget. So it's not excessively stimulative in that sense. The $100 billion sounds like a huge number, and yet a third of it really is just finishing off the COVID programs, and the other 2/3 spread over 3 years. And of course, as we entered this, the economy has done much better than most forecasters believed last year, and certainly that were contained in the budgets of governments. And so that meant that the government had more than $50 billion of extra room to maneuver in the first 2 years of this budget that was unanticipated because the economy has been stronger. In fact, that raises the baseline of revenues forever relative to before. So that extra room to maneuver has allowed them to undertake a number of these initiatives, which, as you say, are likely to add to economic growth, or if anything else, perhaps it's more of a fairness dimension, which they're kind of trademark items for this government. And so we have to wait and see how this turns out. But overall, I think it's hitting the mark.
Well, you know, you've been around for a few crises, actually, in our generation. We call them crises, you know, compared to what our parents and grandparents have suffered through. This
Yeah.
pandemic may well be the worst. And if you look at the numbers in terms of what the spend is, considering what the challenge in the economy is today, is there some way to put some salve on that for those who just look at the deficit numbers, or, you know, just looking, oh, look how much you're spending? And then there's the other side of it, those who, the equity, social piece where, you know, spend more, spend more.
Yeah.
I'm feeling like, considering we're coming out of a pandemic, I hope soon, we're doing okay. You know, we've got half the deficit, or maybe double the deficit that they had in, let's say, other governments in the past where they didn't have a pandemic to deal with.
Well, that's right. So I think in the big picture, you can look at it this way. We had this tremendous trauma hit us, both for individuals and companies, and, you know, for the economy as a whole. The stabilization efforts have taken a lot of forms, but basically have added up to like 20% of national income, roughly speaking. That's how much extra money is being spent at the federal level. And that means that the credit card has to go up by that much, right? So it's like you take a huge trip and you really spend a lot of money. But this, of course, was saving people, you know, from a very bad experience. So that 20% of national income is how much debt is going up, from around 30% to around 50% of national income. And then it's projected to stay there and gently decline just as the economy resumes its growth. And that, of course, is a lower level than you would have said just a few months ago, because the economy has already done better. And I would also say that the things in this budget that are intended to boost growth, daycare is the most important big ticket item, is meant to boost economic growth. Well, those extra growth dividends are not included they're not assumed in the baseline. So if the economy grows faster because of some of these things that they're doing, that'll mean that the deficits will be even smaller than shown here, and the debt level at which we turn the corner will also be lower. So that's something we can look forward to. I mean, right now I wouldn't assume it either, because a lot of things have to still happen for it all to become true. But in terms of a fiscal framework, it respects the minimal things that we need in order to have a credible path forward on the debt side.
Okay. Our ability to rebuild. So clearly we need to get to the end of the pandemic. The doors have to be open, people need to get out, consumers have to start spending. The whole notion that, you know, maybe a half or 3/4 of the population is saving because they can't get out the door right now. And then the other half or quarter are actually suffering. They're laid off, they can't get that other job.
Right.
So, you know, and then lay over top of that very, very hot housing market. You made comments again today about sort of the trade-off. If you want economic growth, some of that trade-off is going to be a very hot market. Depending on who you talk to, if you're talking to someone who owns their home, they're delighted that the prices are going through the roof, probably till their tax bill comes in, their property tax. But if you have young people in your family and you know that they're desperate to start getting into the housing market, did we miss anything? Is that a piece that's going to be more contributory to the economy if we find a way to address how we get young people into housing?
Well, look, they haven't overturned the laws of demand and supply, Sandra. We know those are very fundamental things. House prices go up because more people want to buy them than there are houses. It's not actually more complicated than that. And we know that the supply of housing at the margin is determined by new building, and that is determined by rules around land release, land servicing, and zoning requirements. Those things are not macroeconomic, they're local. And so if you had more of an effort to boost the supply of housing, at least to match our immigration levels, We don't even build enough to cover this. And so I just think, look, anything that's scarce like that, especially, you know, in an ideal situation, that price will go up. What has happened is that the demand for housing has not gone down because of the pandemic. It's actually now shifted. And people want to be out a little bit more where they can have more space because they're going to spend half their time or something like that at home. Even people who return to the office after the pandemic, many of us will have more flexibility. So do we work at home half the time or 4 days a week, or there'll be all different models that emerge. Some will have to be at the office. I get it. But that's going to change a few things. It's going to change demands on our transit infrastructure. It's going to change how many subsidiary services are downtown as opposed to in suburbia. It's going to really have some pretty big effects, and I can't really foretell them, but you can tell which direction it'd be. And that just means that we're going to need even more supply of the classic, you know, family home, whether it's detached or semi-detached, or for that matter, largish condo type homes, more out of the center. And so I think that without that, then the prices will continue to go up like this. And I'm afraid it takes a while for us to catch up to that. You're right. It's meaning that young people are more and more at risk of not being able to achieve that dream.
Yeah, it is a bit scary when you see the average home across Canada, I think, is 700,000 was quoted today. It's just very scary. None of us could have begun that way many years ago. Let me get your comments on the economy and what we know has to happen across the country. We know we've had this traditional issue around being able to get our own Canadian companies to scale to the size being massive international companies. And we keep looking for that magic ingredient that will push more of our companies to trade. Something happened, I think, over the course of the pandemic, shining a light on these geopolitical forces that are making it more difficult to want to look internationally. There's more risk out there internationally. Can you think of a few ingredients that ought to be the focus now? We've got tabled a budget. We can move ahead. Hopefully we're seeing the tail end of a pandemic once we get over this last terrible hump. Can you think of a couple of things that'll settle us down, get us back on the world market, not be afraid to reopen and scale?
Yeah, well, I like your question because I think it is a good time to remind people that a lot of things that we take for granted are actually the product of past opening up of our economy to international trade. We saw this in spades during the Trump administration, you know, an ability, we think, just to shut this down and shut that down and shut that down. And of course, they only think about the micro effect that will have on a very small number of workers. Like, for example, putting tariffs on kitchen appliance or, you know, household appliances. Well, okay, that just raised the price of household appliances for everybody, while just reshoring a handful of jobs, $900 per family per year, you know, in the cost of appliances. You know, no one attributes that rise in prices to that trade action per se, the loss of income, which happens. And so what we need to do is, as policy wonks, you and me, we need to keep reminding people that, you know, what we have today is built on a structure of international trade. If you start taking away the pieces, you'll have that thing go down. And that's bad. People need to understand that. And how do we go on the offensive, which I think is really where your question is. You know, we've seen how we can be at risk. During the pandemic, you know, people get a little bit nationalist about certain things, PPE or vaccines or so on. And I can understand that reaction, but wouldn't it be better to spend more of our efforts diplomatically to ensure that we really are, you know, working together and can have these supply chains? Or perhaps if we think we're vulnerable, replicate a supply chain in another area of the world so that you have two different supply chains for the same product. Old BlackBerry always did that. You know, they had every piece was made in two different countries, so that in case something went wrong, they could still build their BlackBerries. And so anyway, I think that's the sort of de-risking that we could do in supply chains without, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which I think is the risk that we're running now because of these very blunt, we need to bring that back home and reshore this and reshore that. People really underestimating how much that will cost in terms of their ordinary standard of living. It's very significant.
Well, I think you're right. We've been talking a lot about reshoring and the opportunity to de-risk areas that, quite frankly, a year ago we wouldn't have thought about. Rubber, rare earths. Everybody knows what a rare earth is now, apparently, or some component of it. But yet, at the same time, we have to face the fact that we've got events happening as related to China, for example, that we didn't face before, where we actually feel threatened that there's going to be a move afoot that will cut us off from a significant supply of an item. That's not just about building cars in Windsor, Ontario. It's about every sector that needs a computer chip. Looking at militarized action around Taiwan and what does that mean for us, and the kind of geopolitical impact that makes you sit back and say, holy cats, I think we need to look at this. That may cost us more, but some of it, quite frankly, it's a natural event. We're just going to have to bite the bullet and pay more. What do you think that the recent events has made us sit back and say, it may finally be worth it. We may have to pay that little bit more.
Well, and I know you do know this, that the value of a trade agreement is less about tariffs and how things move back and forth, but about the protections that a company has when operating in that foreign country. Okay, so like when we did NAFTA, it wasn't so much about the trade. It ended up that way, but what was the true door opener was knowing that you would get equal treatment, from the legal system in Mexico that anybody else would get. And so I think that we should be pursuing many more, I'll call them international business agreements with other countries. In fact, I would like to take NAFTA or perhaps some other agreement, put it up as a template, and invite anybody who would like to sign that agreement to sign it. Not negotiate it for years and years and years. Just say this is already best in class trade agreement. If you'd like to join our club, all you have to do is sign here. Kind of opening up, I think, would give our companies a lot more opportunities to reach the scale that you're describing, without which we simply can't grow companies. We're too small of a country to grow companies up to a global scale all by ourselves, unlike the United States, where they can. There's a huge difference in the way those two economies operate. And for us, it means we'll always be trade dependent unless we're willing to give up a substantial piece of our standard of living. Sometimes people go to chop off imports from someplace for some reason or other, strategic reasons or whatever. And what they don't forget or they don't remember is that country buys stuff from us and that we rely on that. Well, why should they do that if you're not willing to buy their stuff? There's this give and take, that's why I began by saying, instead of investing, in other words, giving up income by going protectionist, maybe we should be spending more of our resources, our capital, in the diplomatic efforts that are required to actually, live and let live and get on with life.
Right, and I think you're right. I think many think that this nationalism is sort of a recent event. And I remember when Stockwell Day was the minister and I was his counterpart in Ontario, and we were on the phone literally every other day, so I could give him yet another example of what Buy America was doing to our Ontario manufacturers. So it's not new. Yeah, I think it's moved to areas that are impacting more people. So it might have been, a pipeline that, they weren't buying Canadian built pipes, but today they're items that are more our everyday. So it's becoming much more of a discussion at the kitchen table than just at the Chambers event. And maybe that's what's scary. That's what's happened to globalization writ large for many years. We think we're doing really well when we signed CETA finally after many years of negotiating, only to see the UK want to pull out of CETA because they want to be by themselves. So kind of unilateral, are we not going back to the 16th century or something if we have to do one-on-one with all these countries? Like, haven't we grown up in all this time?
Well, fundamentally, the answer to that I think is not really. You know, and I think it's because when people focus on trade, they think of us as trading, let's say, with China. But actually, our trade isn't with China. Our trade is from one Canadian company with a Chinese company. Those are just people who are in business, and they understand what you're saying about scale and about how the trade helps both of them grow their companies. But when we depersonalize that and make it national, then somehow geopolitics becomes important. You see an article just today about how many US companies are so keen to continue to expand their business in China, despite what's going on at the geopolitical level, right? So we know that they'd be taking pretty big risks, you know, of a geopolitical disruption to their business. And yet they think, well, I deal with so-and-so. I try to completely trust that person as a business person, and I'm doing business with them, not with China per se. And secondly, people underestimate the biggest benefit from trade comes from how everything you buy costs less because of trade. The stuff you buy from here or the stuff you buy from abroad costs less because you've allowed trade to happen. That's the biggest effect, the beneficial effect that comes from allowing international trade, more purchasing power. My favorite anecdote is back in 1978 when Valerie and I bought our first color television. That was when we moved to London, Ontario, to go to Western. And it was $549. And that was made in Kitchener. Okay, that was an Electro-Home television. It had Japanese components in it, JVC components, but it was made in Kitchener. Now that would today cost over $2,000 for that television. 19-inch, and not a very big television. Well, now fast forward to today, and for $500, you can buy a gigantic television. Well, where is it made? Well, it's made in probably 10 or 15 countries, all little bits, assembled perhaps in Korea or China or someplace, or even in Mexico, and then it's shipped here. Well, imagine what we can do, you and I, with the $1,500 we save now every time we buy a television. That's real money.
Yeah, I would say that I'm kind of, look, having been an international trade minister and selling Ontario abroad, the part that was the hardest was when it was them expecting to just, we buy their products. I want to talk about us selling, not necessarily us, but right. You have to acknowledge it goes both ways. So I get that. I just wonder if it isn't time that we put two different lists together. These are the things that are critical for living. These are the things that are nice to have, and for some would say more necessary than others. PPE is a really good example. When we realized that we had to turn to our own manufacturers to suddenly ramp up production at their expense so that many, many people in Canada could actually fight COVID, that's a discussion I don't think anyone was welcoming, that we really couldn't rely on our friends to be good for the contracts we signed to get the materials that they promised. Yeah. And in what era do we think a major international company like Pfizer would suddenly decide, I think we're going to change our delivery schedule? No government would have ever expected that to happen. So the world's changed, and it even, as a true international trader, is how I see myself. I actually think having some things local, frankly, it just might be time.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with you, only to say that what we're really talking about is risks have gone up. And let's just agree that there's more than one way to mitigate risks. One way might be to bring home certain supply chains. I understand that. But chances are you wouldn't be able to bring home the entire supply chain. There's still going to be ingredients in there that really you've got to get somewhere else. And think about, where would you stop that line of thinking? Like, would you say, well, food is pretty important too. It's just as important as PPE. So does that mean that we have to grow all of our own food and therefore not import any food? Well, okay, if we stopped all our imports of food, wouldn't other people stop buying our exports of food products? Next thing you know, our standard of living has been reduced dramatically because of all those complex interactions. And people don't even know that those things are driven by the underlying income gains that come from trade. Okay, they just think, oh, well, we sold some soybeans, or we sold, they don't see that business about the television. They don't see that extra $1,500 in their pocket as generated from trade. They claim it as their own. They think it's just their money, and you can do whatever you want to trade, but they'll still have the $1,500. And that isn't true.
Yeah, I totally get the argument. And like I said, I feel naturally like I'm the one that wants to push trade for sure. I've just had this awakening lately, because the things that I've seen are that other countries will actually interfere in their private sector to make life difficult for us. That's something our Canadian government doesn't do. So as much as our Canadian government might have wanted to do what India did when they decided, gee, our pulses don't look so good today, we need to have extra inspectors on site. I know full well our pulses were the same this week as they were the month before. So that is political interference in a trade that would ordinarily be between businesses. Canada doesn't do that. So what's the world body that's going to slap them around for interfering where they ought not to? Because that, frankly, it didn't cost all Canadians, but it certainly cost our Western farmers. So that's where you see that unfairness, that as much as I agree with you, Canadian governments don't operate like some of the foreign governments do in responding to a political event by making businesses suffer.
Yes. But we've been I'm putting quotes around, working on a trade agreement with India since I was at EDC. Okay. And because we let, I think, perfection be the enemy of the good, we work on it and work on it and work on it, and we're negotiating all these little things when in fact we could just be broad brush about it and say, let's start with company protections. Let's think about the investment part of the agreement first, and let's just have a deal between us of some measure, so that it just affords an extra sense of collegiality, and well, that's not what you do to people that you've already signed an agreement with. It just has a little extra something there. Instead of taking decades to find the answer to every potential issue. So anyway, I'm just saying we could de-risk it, maybe not totally in the way you're describing, but we could de-risk the situation quite a lot in other ways. And I think those are worth doing because it preserves that foundation.
Well, I think, I take your point that maybe we'll pull a BlackBerry and try to get two tracks here. I remember the OEs, the big car companies would often have more than one supplier for any significant part. And they learned that lesson the hard way when one small strike in one little town impacted the entire North American line. And I think you were still at EDC when that was happening. I remember it well. So, maybe in Canada, I have to watch the clock, which is hard to do when I'm so focused on what you're saying, Stephen. And I've got to ask people to send questions via the question box. So maybe Andrew can text me or something. I'll see it dinging and I'll know there's a question that our audience may want to ask. But give us some of your overall impressions on items that we need to look at, not necessarily the government, but whoever that authority may be, to really give our economy the boost we're going to need to get out of this pandemic. When and if we know we can rush out the doors, what are some of the top, give me your top 3 best things we should be looking at.
Okay, well, I happen to be one of those that think the economy will rebound mostly by itself. I think it's worth bearing in mind that, the economy is already operating at 97 or 98% of where it was pre-pandemic. That, of course, we hear mostly about the folks in what I call the bottom part of the K. It's a K-shaped expansion. The top part is doing quite well. The bottom part, as we know, is in serious difficulty. And so as long as we go at it quickly, and as the government has, we should be able to get those folks back on the road to recovery while the rest takes care of itself. And I think that's kind of how the budget reads to me, that the putting a bottom under people has done a pretty good job. We know that people have, who worked went well through the whole thing have saved a fair bit of money. The question mark now is, do people maintain a higher level of savings? Having been through what we've been through, both people and firms, I think, might maintain a higher level of liquidity than they did in the past. And that raises a question for how a recovery will unfold. Will it be as snappy as a typical one, or will it be a more gradual one? So I think those are valid questions, but I think it's going to be okay. And what we have to make sure is more focus on the fundamentals, which is what yesterday was about. The infrastructure ingredients, we need some action in the way we manage housing. It's too slow to develop new supply. That's an important side effect of what we've been through, but one that I think was unavoidable, basically. And the daycare one is the one I've been advocating most strongly for, because bringing our labor force participation of women up to levels much closer to men, say it adds something like 2% to the economy over a few years, and then forever, right? That's a lot of money. Plus, it just falls into the government's coffers and pays down that debt faster. But that's only about half of what we'd gain if we got rid of the interprovincial trade barriers, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so we can do, if we did those two things, we can put like a 6% raise, maybe 8% raise into everybody's pockets instead of raising their taxes. And then this debt pile would just get paid down by stronger growth in the economy. You know, that's, I think, worth investing in. I mean, if you could walk out to say to your constituents, look at this, we figured out how to do this without raising taxes at all. Wouldn't that be a great political message? Isn't it worth investing some negotiating with other provinces to get those trade barriers out of the way? I mean, I don't even know why they're there, but it's free money lying on the sidewalk and we refuse to pick it up. So those are my two favorites. I only got two.
You know what? But I love that one of them is childcare and certainly early childhood education and its impact on women and getting women back in the workforce. I don't want to say it had to take a woman in that position in the portfolio of finance to actually do it, because governments have talked about it for a long time. But I think you're right. We probably haven't incorporated impacts of more people participating in the workforce on what that's going to do to future budgets and just the balance sheet of the government overall. That'll be very positively received to get more women in, women that are already here, in many cases already trained, and they just couldn't get out of the house because they do have to take on the predominance of childcare duties at home. So I think that's good. I like hearing a former Bank of Canada executive saying childcare is number one, and that's a really good plug for the budget that was just tabled. Stephen?
Well, yeah, I certainly agree with everything you just said. Now, bear in mind that, of course, you said it took a woman perhaps to get it across the finish line, but it's really just the first leg of a big relay race. Because the next stage is the provinces need to get together with the feds and work out how they'll deploy this capacity. And just like with the infrastructure program, that took a long time just because. You're better able to comment on that than I am, but it seems to take an awful long time for Fed-Prov kinds of interactions to actually get done. But let's just say, if you could say, this is instead of having to raise taxes, I think that's a tremendous motivator, a political motivator for getting that job done. Because it's obviously painful for any government to have to raise taxes, and many will be looking at how do we do that given what we've been through. But if we boost growth with smart structural policies, we shouldn't really have to.
Well, here, that's a fantastic note to finish on. And I hope you're going to be dead on the money on that one. Any parting comments? I hate to end this because we could go off on a whole other tangent. I wanted to get you talking about sustainability and your views on climate change impact, how governments respond to it. And I know you have lots to say on that matter as well. We might have to get you to come back to the Pearson Center with more talk. Any final comment though for us and for the people who are listening today, Stephen?
Well, I think one of the things I'll say is that budget yesterday had, you know, hundreds of things in it, which many of them have great value. So I hope that there's enough firepower to actually implement all those things. But pick your top ones and advocate for those, as I've just done. I said, well, look, I could give you 15 ideas, but hey, let's not. Let's just do daycare. Let's do it for real, and let's do interprovincial barriers. I mean, if I had those two things, I think a lot of the other stuff just wouldn't be needed because we would generate enough extra activity in the economy that we see the benefits right away. You know, I think a lot of things that we do are sort of more like Band-Aid type things as opposed to more fundamental things like eating all your vegetables and not, you know, those more fundamental things. So anyway, for me, simplify it if possible, give something for governments to focus on. I do think that the budget leaves open the question, are we prepared for another big event like this pandemic fiscally? Does that mean, if not, does that mean we need to find ways to pay the debt down relative to the size of the economy more quickly? And if we do, should we do it through an even more emphasis on those things that grow the economy instead of raising taxes? That's a choice that we always face, I think. There are always things we could do. We know that taxation is inefficient. If we switched all to consumption taxes, a GST, well, our sales taxes, well, we would raise more money and more efficiently and distort fewer things. So imagine if you took all those things that you tax and just buried them all in one GST and eliminated all the others. Imagine that.
Well,
it would work.
Economist for a long time. I have a feeling that you had a hand in the development of that HST policy back in time. And in fairness, it's always in hindsight that you look back and say that was probably a good idea. So thank you so much. Thanks for your participation today. And in speaking to everybody who's joined us today, thanks again for participating at the Pearson Center. I want to welcome you back this evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be speaking with, actually hosted by one of our own board members, Don Arsenault. He's going to be speaking with Will Marshall from the Washington Institute of Progressive Policy. And in true nonpartisan spirit, we have other guests joining him as well, like Elizabeth May, and I think maybe a couple others. I may have missed it, but in any event, welcome. Come back and visit with us. Stephen, thanks for joining us today. And for right now, we'll just say a bientôt. Thank you.
Very much. See you. Bye-bye.